Today we've been going through the book of Ephesians, if you recall, and we remember the first 3 chapters talk about our position. Last 3 talk about our practice. If you remember, then we talked about in chapter 5, it says to understand the will of God. And then if you remember, he said then if you're wanting to do the will of God, the first was to walk as wise men, making the most of your time. And then you remember he went in and we talked about the purpose-driven church. If you want to understand the will of God, you need to have the Holy Spirit control you and working within the church. He then went into the home, you remember, and he talked about the role of a wife in the home, and that she is to submit in respect to her husband. And then he went to the husband and said, husband, you need to love your wife as Christ loved the church. You need to leave your father and mother, and you need to learn all you can about her and to honor her. And then he goes into the children and says, children, you are to obey your parents. And if you remember, also not only to obey them, but you're also to honor them. And then it goes into, we saw last week, he talked about the role of the fathers also was don't provoke your children, but to encourage them in the instruction of the Lord and to discipline. So now that he's been talking about the home, he now wants to know what's the will of God in the workplace. So they could call that the title, The Will of God in the Workplace, or maybe a better topic would be, who's boss? Who's boss? And so I think it's important for us. I want you to think about this. I was reading this, and tell me what you think if this is you, because this has happened probably to all of us. This happened in 1970, and the guy was at Dallas Seminary. And let's see what he has to say. New Year's Eve was a big night when I was going to seminary, not because we celebrated, went to a lot of parties, because it was my biggest income night of the year. I was working as a doorman at a hotel to put our family through seminary, and the biggest night for tips was New Year's Eve. As a doorman, you would hold cars out front for wealthy people, and they would come in Fairmont Hotel, which at the time, around 1970, was the nicest hotel in the Southwest. It came out of the Fairmont Hotel chain, begun by Benjamin Swing, his Fairmont Hotel now built in San Francisco. On New Year's Eve, I could expect about $1,000 in tips. 1970, 50 years ago. He said to keep that in perspective, that's the same year Roger Staubach made $27,000 as a professional, and the best. So you think about $1,000 in one night. In other words, for me, it was a big deal. So I put on my tails, got my top hat and white gloves, and checked the mirror. I met all the specs, so I headed for the elevator. I signed in, and as I was signing in, the front office manager came up and said, Dave, we're going to need 2 doormen tonight. I know this is your night, but we only have 3 doormen, the other 2 are black. I don't think it'd look right to have a black doorman and a white doorman working together. So we're going to send you down to the garage. You can open doors for people as they drive in, and the other 2 guys will be up front. I said, but this is my night. I wouldn't get any tips downstairs. Besides, the other 2 guys aren't even scheduled. He replied, well, this is what I've told you. What would you do? In my heart, I knew why he was doing this. He didn't like the seminary students that worked at the hotel. He was an immoral man, and the general manager of the hotel hired seminary students to stop the practice of using his hotel as a brothel. The previous night, doorman had 6 call girls and he was working with. In other words, he made most of his money as a pimp. The front office manager got a cut of the action. But the general manager of the hotel was a new Christian. He wanted the pimping to stop. So he hired seminary students as his night doorman in Bellman and made the front office manager mad. He was taking it out on me. What are you going to do? Well, the general manager of the hotel and I had become good friends. I began work in the garage at 4 o'clock. His office was just 10 steps from where I was standing. People didn't start coming in until evening. So when I was heading down to the garage, I had the strongest temptation to just go into his office and tell him what had happened. I knew he would say it was unfair. I also knew he would send me up front to the hotel where I'd get my tips for the night. So I was doing a slow burn. So I prayed, Lord, what do you want me to do? What would you do? I'll tell you what he did here later. That's the rest of the story, isn't it? And what he does the rest of the story, he was studying in class the book of Ephesians. So while he was sitting on the chair, he read this passage, and that's what determined what he did. So let's see if we can look to see what he read, to see what we should do. So notice, the question again I ask you, who's boss? The will of God at work. And so what I want us to do, he's going to say slaves, and then we can call them employees, because if you remember in the Roman Empire, over half of the people were slaves. And what happens is when we think of slaves, we think of somebody doing a menial task. That could be, but when they take over nations, they would take teachers, they take everybody. And so a lot of times you would be an educated teacher or whatever it might be, and you then would be a teacher in the home to take care of the people's kids, but you were still a slave. So let's look at it, what he wants. So I think about it of the employee. The other, we have two extremes we need to avoid. So today as an employee, we have one group that want to basically, it's their idol. Everything is hooked up in their work and they make it their idol. You have the other who do as little as possible. So we want to avoid that. So think about it, but we want to examine our attitude and our actions. So see what he tells us, the mandate. Now what you have is keep going back and forth, we will, between Ephesians chapter 6, and we'll have that in verse 5 to 9. And he also says the same thing in Colossians, which he wrote roughly the same time, prison epistle, chapter 3, 22 through chapter 4 and verse 1. So we'll kind of flip back and forth. So notice then what you have, the mandate to obey in chapter 6 and verse 5. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh. Boy, that sounds great, doesn't it? You're given a mandate. How many of us would say you obey them when they are nice? And what you have is he's writing to Christian slaves, and in a minute he's going to write to Christian masters. And so it's important to keep that in mind in the time frame that you have. But notice what he says. The word there for obey is the exact same word used for the one in chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents. And what that has is two words put together. It means to be under and then to listen and do. So then as an employer or as an employee, then when the master or the employer says for me to do something, I need to listen and obey. But how many of us listen and obey, but we don't have a real good attitude about it? Okay, he's going to address that in a minute, and he'll tell you why. So think about it. We're told to listen and obey. I think it's important to realize it's because of the love factor. If you love me, according to John 14, verse 15, and then also 21, if you love me, you'll do what?
Keep my commandments.
Keep my commandments. Okay, so that's going to be important to keep in mind when we look at this. So the mandate then is to do that. The only time you would go against it is in Acts 5:29, if the owner or the employer or whatever is asking us to do something that's against Scripture, then obviously we would then not have to do it, but we'd have to be willing to suffer consequences. If you go against what the employer is telling you to do, you can be fired for it, even if you're doing what is right. So just realize that. So notice that I think it's interesting what you have then to do that. Notice the distinctions. It says in the flesh. Okay? Why would he say in the flesh? Because in the spirit, as a Christian slave, who is your master on the spiritual side? The Lord is. So in the flesh, when you're at work and so on, you have a master you need to obey. But you also then have a spiritual master, which he'll address in a moment. So you have that mandate. Notice then, so your action is, when the employer tells you to do something, you're supposed to what?
Obey.
Do it. Okay? But how many people do you work with, and how many times has it happened to us, we have a terrible attitude when we do it. Now he's going to address the manner. He's given us the mandate to obey, now he's going to give us the manner. Look at the manner, and look at me between both passages, Ephesians 6:5 and Colossians 3:22. Notice what he tells you then here on the manner. It says with fear and trembling. Now with the fear and trembling, it'll actually, when you get to Colossians, it'll say fear and trembling unto the Lord. So it's not that you're fearing the owner, you're realizing who is really your boss. When you're responding to your employer, your human boss, you actually have a boss who's above that you're responding to. So with fear and trembling, I need to go look beyond my human boss and realize I'm looking at a heavenly boss who put me or allowed me to be in this position. And so when I'm responding to my employer, I need to remember I'm responding to the Lord, good or bad. So fear and trembling would be one. Notice that it has in Colossians 3:22. If you look, you'll see that it talks about under the Lord, the fear and the trembling part. Notice that then it says sincerity of heart in verse 5. You notice it says, according to the flesh, fear and trembling, the sincerity of your heart as to the Lord. The sincerity of heart, it comes from an interesting Greek word where we get our word sincerely from. How many of us sign our letters sincerely? Okay, it's used two ways. It means, if you look in back in those days, it means without folds, or it also means without wax. Okay, the reason you say without folds, if you're selling garment, you didn't have a way to keep the moths out. So what would happen if you had a moth and you had a hole in it, but you wanted to sell the garment? Put it in a fold, and who's going to see it? What you have is you had cups, and they'd get cracks in it. They'd fill the cracks in with wax. And so they go to sell it, they couldn't see it, but when it got hot, what would happen? So it says sincerely, without wax. In other words, when you're responding with the right attitude, it's not a put-on, it's real. And so notice he tells us, by the way, who chooses our attitude? We do. Go back to the slaves. They had nothing most of the time. When you had Rome come to your country and take it over, there's not a whole lot you can do to keep it from happening. There wasn't a whole lot Belgium can do to keep Germany from overtaking. But then how do you respond when you are overtaken and you are the employee or slave? So notice you have sincerity of heart. In Colossians 3:23, it also will address it. It says to do it heartily. How many people do things heartily? Okay, you're given a job to do at work, you don't like it. You don't think it's fair. They didn't do it right, but how many of us are going about and doing it heartily? But then it says, as unto the Lord. So when the boss is giving me a job to do, and well, I've had 4 years of education, or 5, or 10, or whatever you want to say, or 20 years experience. What are he doing telling me to take out the trash? That's above me. Well, is he paying you?
Yep.
Okay, so I need to do it heartily. Okay, now if the Lord asked you to take the trash out, what would you do?
Take it out.
And how much would say, oh, sure, be glad to. How many of you would be glad to open the door, open the gate, do whatever? So how many of us are looking past our employer, our boss, and saying, that's the Lord standing there, and that's the Lord asking me, and I'm going to have the hearty attitude to do it right. If we had that kind of attitude, do you think people would notice a difference in the workplace? They would see a difference in the workplace. It was amazing when I worked at UPS when I was in college. Where I went to school was only 300 students at the max. When I was at UPS, 25% of the workforce came from the school I was at. Why did they hire people? They're supposed to go through the Alabama Employment Agency. As soon as they saw somebody's name coming from Southeastern Bible College, they'd hire them above others. Why? Because the work ethic of the people that came from the school, but it's like when that others come, we also would then tell them, hey, you're representing the Lord, you're representing the school, you better do a good job or else you're causing damage to the school as well as to the Lord. So we need to do the same thing here. So when the boss tells us to do something that's beyond what we think we ought to be able to do, remember we're responding to the Lord. So notice it's interesting when you have it. Notice that in verse 5 it even says right at the end, notice it says, as unto Christ, we are slaves of Christ. How many of us ever stop and think, I'm a slave of Christ? Now the word there is doulos. Okay, and I may be a slave to my owner in this context. I didn't have a choice. I may be going to work because I don't have a choice. I need food on the table, whatever. But I am willingly choosing to be a slave of Jesus Christ. That's the word for doulos. How many of us see ourselves as a slave of Christ? In the word doulos, you give yourself wholly to somebody else's will. If the Lord placed me here, I'm giving myself 100%. It's also interesting when you look at it in verse 6 then, notice what he says, not by way of eye service as men pleasers. You ever work with people that when boss is around, they have a totally different work ethic? You ever had that? You ever been around the ones when when it's time to volunteer, if the boss is around, what happens?
Me.
Oh, me. Right? As soon as he's gone, what happens? Oh, then when the boss comes around and he has a broom in his hand, what do they do? Oh, then they'll sweep. As soon as the boss leaves, what happens? Okay, so notice it says, not as eye pleasers. So I need to be, by the way, does God ever go to sleep? So is his eyes always watching? So if he's always watching, I can never not be the eye pleaser. But we all have that at different times, with being an eye pleaser. What happens when you go get your picture taken? Right? You know, we want to make sure we look just right. I even had one I had a picture taken with a while back, and they told me, they said, grab the back of my neck. I said, what? Grab the back of my neck. I said, what for? I said, well, when you grab the back of the neck as a lady, said, it takes away the chicken look. Okay? We all, we have it. But when it comes to work service, what are we doing? How many of us are going to work and working unto the Lord? Irregardless of where they have us, what to do. You may have been overlooked 5 times in a row for a promotion. God knows it. People are watching. What are we doing unto the Lord? So you think about it, is the bondslave. So notice then you have this manner that you have. I think we need to have a Chick-fil-A attitude. Amazingly. What do they say whenever you ask for something to do? It's my pleasure. How many of us as Christians have that attitude? When we're given things to do and we say, it's my pleasure. Now, if we use the words but don't have the attitude, what's going to happen? It'll become out of sarcasm on it. But how many of us have the right action, doing what the employer tells us to do, and then you have the right attitude? And by the way, does that make any difference in the workplace? But who makes the choice? The employer gives us the work. Who gives us the attitude? We do, right? So notice the mandate was there, the manner for obedience was there, how we're supposed to do it. But I want you to notice, what about the motive? How many of you ever like motives? Why do I want to do this? So I think about it, when you go to it, the question you can ask yourself, when was the last time I went to work and saw myself as a slave for Christ? And that could be in anything. By the way, is there such a thing as, Thomas Aquinas is the one that penned it, or it's attributed to him. I don't think it's a good thing to say. But he penned that you have the difference between secular work and sacred work. There is no such thing. Everything is work for God. And don't think that one is better than another, and you'll see it by the end of this text. If you're working changing tires, it's just as important as somebody else who's doing something else for working under the Lord. So notice that, what about the last one on this part when it talks about the motive? Notice what he says there. Notice it says that it's the will of God. In Ephesians 6 and verse 6, the will of God from the heart. This is what God wants me to do. So what does God want me to do? He wants me to work hard 100% whether people are watching or not. And he wants me to have a good attitude whether I'm being watched or not. So he's told me to do it, and he's told me how to do it. But now then you think about it, you look at the last part, what about the motive? It's in verse 7 and 8. With good will, rendering service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. You mean how I serve at work with the right attitude, with the right actions. God sees it. He promises he's going to do what for me? Reward me. It's an interesting word that you have here. I'll spell it. You tell me what word you think it comes from, our English word comes from. Kommistai. Sounded out, commission. How have you ever seen you're on commission, folks? You will get paid back by the Lord in eternity if you have the right attitude and the right action for where he has placed you. He's promised a reward. We've promised other rewards that you have. You have it in Matthew 7, 6, where you have how you pray. for people or for God, whether you get rewarded on this earth or eternity, how you give, all these different things. God takes notice. That's why in Revelation 21, when Christ comes back, it says his reward is with him. So think about it. When you look at this part of the motive, notice it's here now. What I do here now, but although I won't receive it till later. Now think about it. It's also, he says, for slave or for free. It doesn't matter whether you're a slave, you need to do it with the right attitude or action, or whether you're working for somebody as a free person, right attitude, right action. So you think about it. How many of us want to take something with us? You ever been told you can't take anything with you? Well, there is some things we can take with us. We can take people with us, but if we do things with the right attitudes, that's why in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, I've made a deposit in the Lord. He's keeping it for me. I can make deposits in eternity if I want to. Right attitude, right actions at work. That's for employees. What about employers? What's God's role for the master or for, which by the way, also I failed to mention, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4, it calls this an inheritance. If you look in Colossians, it actually says an inheritance for your reward. It's that cross-reference. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1, it makes the statement, it is imperishable, it's undefiled, and it will not fade away. This is what he's promised. When I work here, it's going to perish, it's going to fade away, and do different things for a month. But he's promising to reward me with something that will be eternal. So then what about the roll call for the master or the employer? It's in chapter 6 and verse 9. It's also in Colossians 4 and verse 1. And it says, masters, do the same things to them. What does it mean, same things to them? Do we need to have, if you're the employer, you need to have the right attitude and the right action. If you look in the Colossians context of chapter 4 and verse 1, I'll just read it for you unless you have your finger there. In Colossians, it says, masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness. How often do you think you get justice and fairness you ever been around where employers that they don't give justice and fairness in the workplace? Maybe it's better to say, how many of you been in places where you've had justice and fairness? But again, you think about it, if you're a master and you're a Christian, which is who he's writing to, do you think there's other masters who are beating their slaves, who are not treating them properly, doing different things, and you all of a sudden start treating yours correctly? Do you think there's any type of social pressure? You bet there will be. But whose master do you have? So it's important for us to recognize then the mandates there, the positive, right attitude, right action, fairness, justice. You'll notice it will tell you not to threaten you. You ever been in a place where you've been threatened? Okay, masters have said not to be threatened. Okay, we've all been there, and perhaps we've all done that. Notice in the motive, I think it's interesting in verse 9, giving up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. How you treat people here who are under you, realize fairness, justice, not with threatening, but you have a master you're going to have to give an account to one day. But how many of us want to make the master pay, the employer pay? How many of us want to take God's place? I want to, then we don't work like we should. So our job is to do what? To work as unto the Lord with the right attitude. The master is, the employer is to treat him correctly, fairly, justly. Notice he has a master. And he'll have to give an account one day. But how many times in the workplace do we ever stop and think of it this way? So every time you see your boss, you need to look above your boss and whose picture do you need to have up there? God. That could be same with your spouse, correct? That could be same thing with children and parents. Look above, see the Lord. I think it's interesting. So when you look at this, the fairness and the justice part. So if I'm in management, do I treat those under me as I desire Christ to treat me? When you do. But notice that we've seen God's role for the employee. We've seen God's role for the employer. But I want us to look at two other passages to think about what we're talking about this. What about God's real? You know, you have to go back most of your older like I am, you'll remember this. Remember you go to the movie theater and would you have that movie reel that would go on? You ever realize there's a God that has a reel too? So let's look at two passages. Look over in Titus chapter 2 for a moment. Just turn to the right a little bit. And then we'll also look at 1 Timothy. Titus chapter 2, starting in verse 9 and 10, and then we'll also look at 1 Timothy 6 and verse 1. Notice he says, urge bond slaves to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing, not argumentative. Have you ever had trouble arguing with the boss? Not pilfering. The boss isn't watching, we just sit and take the money on the clock. Not showing, but showing all good faith. Notice what it says, that they, the bosses, may adorn the doctrine of God, our Savior, in every aspect. Now, what does he mean, our doctrine? Go over to the other passage, he'll explain it. So notice then, it tells you we shouldn't be argumentative, we shouldn't be pilfering, work like we should, because it was a doctrine of God that we're showing. Look over in 1 Timothy then and see if it'll explain it a little clearer to you. Chapter 6 and verse 1. Let all who are under the yoke as slaves regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine may not be spoken against. So what he's saying is, the only doctrine that many employers are going to see, the doctrine of Christ, is what? Is how you live your life. Do we realize we're God's reel on this earth and people see how we respond? How many people know you're a Christian? So do they expect a different work ethic from you? Do they expect a different attitude from you? And when you don't, who is going to be attacked? And I had different ones I worked with who've been believers that did not treat people well, and I remember people say at work, if they're a Christian, I don't want any part of it. Is the doctrine of God being spoken ill of? So when I go look at it, as an employee, what do I need to do? The right attitude, the right action. Because I am revealing to the people around me, who may not know their Bible or even, but what does a Christian look like and how is he supposed to respond? So think about it. When you look at it, what picture are people seeing of me? Coming out of my mouth, out of my actions. So let's think of some of the different ones. I'll give these questions now. I forgot, I promised I'd give you the end of the story. What video am I showing at work? God's video or a fallen man? Do I do my work with the right attitude and the right action? Does the line, remember you have the dot, which is this line, the line is determined. Does the line have a role in my work ethic? Well, let me read the rest of the story. See how well he does here. So back to the Fairmont Hotel. The people wouldn't start rolling in until 8 o'clock. I started work at 4. So he's going to sit there on his chair in the garage for how long? And how of us would be getting a little hot and blood pressure? There wasn't anything to do but to go down there and sit on a chair waiting for them to come. While I was sitting on the chair, I did a slow burn. It was just impossible for me not to think about how unfair the situation was. I went over and over it in my mind. I knew I was just a few steps from the general manager's office. I knew he would reinstate me if I went in there. I had my Bible with me and I'd be working on the book of Ephesians. I said to myself, all right, where am I in this book? God led me to this passage. As I went through it, I said, oh my gosh, this is absolutely unfair. What an opportunity. If I respond right now with the right attitude and the right actions, I may lose $1,000, but I might gain something that could glorify Christ forever and ever. This way of thinking totally transformed my life to glorify God forever. No way. Lose something like this that will be there forever and ever. No way. So when people started arriving at 8 o'clock, I opened the door of their car and said, Happy New Year. I gave them a smile and said, I hope you all have a great time. Hundreds of them. Not one tip. It was one of the greatest nights of my life. I hope the boss was happy.